You know, once in a while, some article comes out that I could best describe as concern trolling about Bitcoin and Bitcoin's energy consumption and its carbon output. And I feel like whenever I read those articles, they're always tinged with a sense of jealousy. Uh, Bitcoin made a bunch of money or is making a bunch of money for people, but not the person writing the article. Maybe I shouldn't blame them. Maybe they're just tapping into some deep-seated need that people have to think that Bitcoin is doing something bad, and that they're justified for not having gotten into Bitcoin a long time ago when they first heard about it. Anyway, these articles consistently troll me. They're kind of on the downturn right now, just like Bitcoin's price, but when Bitcoin goes back up again, I'll probably be seeing you. All right, I'll get back to the rest of this awesome video in a second, but first a word from our sponsor, me. I have this thing that I'm working on. You can find it at together.lol or together.lol, and it's a place for like-minded people to meet, hang out, and chat with each other. It's in super embarrassing alpha stage right now, but I'd love for you to check it out and tell me what you think. Anyway, back to the fantastic video. So my feeling is that when someone is acting like they care about carbon emissions from something, if it's not maybe the top 3 things in the world that emit carbon, like, the biggest industries or transport or something like that, what they're really trying to do is equate the particular thing with the sense of badness. And it mostly works on a certain type of population. It's the like liberal Democrat in the US, highly educated kind of people who care about global warming and carbon emissions and things like that. And it's this effort to make them associate thing with bad. So Bitcoin, carbon, bad. And I think that Bitcoin's actually really great. I think that the carbon it emits, the energy it consumes, are both lower impact than has been stated, and they're well worth it. And I think we say that about a lot of industries. People will wring their hands about how much carbon is emitted by certain activities, but also refuse to reduce how much they do those activities. And I think Bitcoin's actually a little bit better than that. I think it's a really useful thing for a lot of people. So I mostly view that as concern trolling. The first common trope that I'll see journalists do is to take all the transactions that Bitcoin has done. For the purposes of this video, let's use the year 2022 as our example. So they'll take all the transactions that happen in 2022 and they'll divide by the average energy cost, or how much energy they think got used, or how much carbon they think that energy emitted. And then they'll say, each transaction in Bitcoin uses 1 gigacarbon or whatever. It uses as many as burning 1 million houses down or 1 million rainforests or whatever. And that is a completely nonsensical comparison. When a Bitcoin miner is going to mine for Bitcoin, they've bought a whole bunch of equipment and they've connected to electricity somewhere. Those are their 2 costs. And they want to defray the cost of that capital, that equipment that they bought. So they're going to mine no matter what, as long as the Bitcoin that they're earning from mining is of greater value than the electricity cost that's going into it. So they're not going to stop mining pretty much for anything unless it stops being profitable. If you come to a Bitcoin miner and you say, here's my transaction, I'll pay you an average of $1.50 to move $1 million around. From a miner's perspective, they say, great, that's fantastic. Keep them coming. Give me all the transactions you got. Pay higher fees. I don't care. In fact, I care the other direction. Please pay higher fees. They love that. So a transaction basically costs a miner like negative money. They make more money. The more transaction fee you pay, the better it is for a miner. Why would they ever want to turn that down? And in terms of their processing, it doesn't cost any additional energy to include a transaction. So it's completely nonsensical to say that 1 Bitcoin transaction costs, in some cases, 330,000 credit card transactions, because the miners are going to mine anyway, and the transactions are free. So you can't make this comparison. It's like applesauce to oranges. You're comparing a rate of something to a fixed amount. It just doesn't make any sense. Another thing is I'll frequently see Bitcoin compared to gold. I think it's a really apt comparison. Sending Bitcoin to somebody is a lot like emailing gold to somebody. You have this lump of value somewhere, and then you can just transmit it to them. With gold, you have to physically transmit this object, but it is very small. It's very dollar dense for what it is. But for Bitcoin, you can just sort of email it to them, which you can't really do with gold. That would be cute. You attach gold to your email and you send it off, but you can't. So in my opinion, Bitcoin does the same job of a transferable store value that gold does, but it does it a little bit better. And so I sort of thought of those things as a comparison. Gold exists, people invest in it, whatever. But gold also gets mined. I don't know how much thought you've given to gold mining. I think very few people watching this will have really ever thought about it. But gold mining is an activity that people have been doing since antiquity, and they still do it. Mining for gold emits a huge amount of carbon. It emits about 20 times as much carbon as Bitcoin does. And I don't see a lot of journalists talking about how bad that is. I don't regularly see articles that are like, oh, gold's shiny and all, but just think of the carbon impact. That's really terrible. Oh, think of what gold's doing to the environment. Nobody cares. Maybe the gold industry cares a little bit, but nobody seems to care. And which further makes me think that people want to equate Bitcoin with something bad. But with gold, they're like, well, gold's kind of unassailable. It would be really hard to hurt public opinion on gold, so I guess we'll just leave it alone. Or nobody's asking us to criticize gold, so we're not going to bother. Either way, you don't see these equivalent articles. But but gold mining consumes a huge amount of electricity and carbon. It earns profit for the miners. Some people hate profit, but it's actually a pretty profitable activity because there's a lot of barriers to entry. So gold's not free. The sort of ironic thing about gold too is people spend all this money to dig it up from the ground, extract it and refine it, and then they mostly bury it in the ground again in underground vaults, or they put it above ground in concrete vaults or whatever. So we're just trying to move gold from one place on the earth to another, but now I know where it is, so it's my gold. And I find that sort of humorous. Once in a while I'll see Bitcoin compared to dollars, as if dollars are something that just exists all around us, like the weather. Why would you use Bitcoin when you could just use dollars? Banks don't want to work with Bitcoin. Why don't you put dollars into a bank? And, it's free to transfer dollars. More on that later. But it costs a lot of money to maintain dollars. I don't know if you've given a lot of thought to how much it goes into maintaining dollars, but they're definitely not free. So between the US Secret Service, the FDIC, the Bureau of Credit Unions, the Bureau of Engraving, the US Mint, the government spent about $8 billion last year just doing that stuff to maintain the dollar. So they have to ensure that banks keep sufficient reserves on hand. They have to combat counterfeiting. They have to actually print physical bills. They have to mint physical coins. And all of that costs a lot of money. And it emits who knows how much carbon. I'm sure it's a good deal more than Bitcoin, but it's hard to say. But it takes real money to maintain the dollar, and someone has to do it. And also you as a dollar user have to trust that they're doing it in a responsible way. That's sort of implicit. So on top of that, the government maintaining just the currency layer of dollars, so mostly the physical part you can touch and the checking account balances that you can pull out, banks also create a lot of money all the time by taking it in, holding some of it, and lending some more out. That's how we get a lot of the money supply that we work with. The government regulates that too. The US government regulates it. Other countries regulate it too. And to some extent, banks are regulating it. They have to decide what their own policy is going to be. And the cumulative effect of all those policies creates a large monetary policy. So that's not free either. The operational expenses of banks are enormous, and that gets reflected in us using dollars. One estimate I saw was that it costs about 2.5% per year for the balances that banks hold to operationally maintain that. So that's a huge cost. It's a lot more than it costs to maintain the monetary policy of Bitcoin, which is mostly just a couple of programmers checking in code. And they arguably don't even need to. They mostly do it because they want to. So it's not free. Like, dollars don't just exist as some ambient thing that's around us. It takes a huge amount of work to maintain them. So it doesn't make sense to treat it like it's this free alternative to Bitcoin. It's not. So that leads me to another comparison that I'll see, which is usually Visa, MasterCard, some kind of transaction network. Like the headline I was mentioning, 330,000 transactions on Visa for one transaction on Bitcoin. That's a completely ridiculous comparison because Visa doesn't have to implement the security of dollars or the monetary policy. They don't even have to do a lot to store the dollars. They can just use a bank. And when people transfer the dollars around, usually they're just moving them between bank accounts, which is also something Visa doesn't have to maintain. Bitcoin maintains all of that. So when people compare Visa to Bitcoin, they're like, okay, let's just take this thin layer off of the top of something that sits on top of this huge stack that is dollars, this huge amount of human effort and human endeavor and resources. And we'll just say, oh, this thin layer, they can transfer stuff really cheaply. If you're going to do an apples to apples comparison of that, that would be the stack of Bitcoin and then something like Coinbase sitting on top of it. If you have a Coinbase account and someone else does and you want to transfer money between them, it costs you $0 also. So is that an apt comparison? For the cost of one Visa transaction, I can send one Coinbase transaction. It doesn't make a very good headline. So I think I'll keep seeing those comparisons in the future, but I always find them kind of irritating. Okay, so if we're not going to talk about carbon, let's talk about how many dollars it takes to transact some money. So I picked arbitrary amount of $1,000. Seems good. So if you want to send $1,000 of cash to someone, just say from US to the US, the best thing I found was Western Union. It costs $60 to do that. That seemed very high to me. I didn't know they charged 6%, but that's kind of the fee that you pay if you want to go cash to cash. I don't know how much know your customer regulations they have to comply with, but probably some. But if you want to transmit cash to someone else who can just receive cash, that's what you're looking at, $60. It's not free. You might be tempted to say, hey, I can transfer it from my bank to this other guy's bank. But that involves some risk on your part. It involves other businesses. This is one of those things where if you're not the customer, you're the product. So they're not charging you for your checking account, but why is that? It's because they're taking your money, lending it to other people, etc. So it's not free to send dollars. If you use Western Union, it's $60. So then our next competitor is Visa, often held up as super cheap compared to Bitcoin transactions. If you want to pay for something with Visa, the merchant is going to have to pay $29.30 at their current going rate because they charge 2.9% plus 30 cents. So that's what you're looking at for transacting $1,000. Very far from free. $29, I mean, maybe it's not bad, but they're still taking a pretty sizable cut. So it's not that cheap. And finally, our final competitor with Bitcoin is gold. If you want to send gold from US to US, the best way I found was registered mail. And it costs $13.30 to insure your gold to use in registered mail. That's pretty good. That ends up being a 1.3% fee. Not too bad. Once the gold gets to the other end, the person's going to have to do something with it. It's a lot harder to use as a currency than most of these other things. But still, that's not too bad of a transaction fee. So then we have our final competitor, Bitcoin. Bitcoin's fees in 2022 were an average of $1.50. And that's across all transaction sizes. So if you want to send a dollar, then it's $1.50. That's why you can't use Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee. But if you want to send $1 billion, it's also $1.50. So Bitcoin sort of scales up in attractiveness as the size of your transfers gets larger. And that's just using the raw Bitcoin network. If you want to use Coinbase, it's cheaper. But that's another reason I feel like these transaction cost comparisons are kind of ridiculous. It's very difficult to transact $1,000 or more for less than $1.50 unless you're doing a bunch of other things. You're taking some risk using a bank. You're paying a huge fee to some other third party. There's a lot of ways where you can say that something is cheaper than Bitcoin only if you ignore all the costs. And I feel like that's sort of the thread that runs through all of this. Bitcoin is often the cheapest thing unless you ignore the costs of the other things, in which case, oh, now suddenly it's very expensive. And that's why I feel like it's mostly concern trolling. The things that people are concerned about are not the things that matter. And none of the comparisons that they do are apples to apples. So this leads me to the second great headline that I saw. It was the real world costs of the digital race for Bitcoin. When I first saw that, I thought, oh yeah, they're going to talk about how much carbon it costs, right? And then I thought for a second, I was like, wait a minute. So the whole point of Bitcoin, one of the major innovations there is that Bitcoin has a proof of work system. So there is a way to consume resources in the real world and then prove digitally that they were consumed. And one of the great things about Bitcoin is once you've proved that, you can reuse it. So someone has to do all this work to mine a Bitcoin. They have to prove that they expended some resources in the real world. But once they do, then you can transact that Bitcoin forever, only paying transaction fees. That's really great. And it requires that you prove that you did some work in the real world. So when someone says, hey, did you know there are real world costs to Bitcoin? It's like, yes, Bitcoin is achieving one of its design goals. What's next? They're going to find out that you can use Bitcoin for transactions. What if some of them are for crime? Oh my goodness. Who would have ever thought that such a thing would happen? So it's great that the media is trying to keep everyone honest there by proving that Bitcoin does one of the things it was designed to do. But I just was really amused at that headline. So once in a while, people will ask me, do you think I should buy Bitcoin? And my answer is always yes. I think it's a worthwhile speculative instrument. I don't know how you would feel like it stacks up against gold or stocks or just leaving your money to rot in a checking account, which is something a lot of people choose. But I find it to be pretty compelling. I think it's a pretty neat thing. And I think historically it's done pretty well price-wise. And I don't think it's headed down to zero forever. So if you want some, don't buy more than you can afford to lose. I definitely recommend it. And if you have any issues with anything that I said, if you think that anything I said is wrong, or especially if you can prove me wrong, that'd be great. I'd love to hear about it. Please let me know. All right, well, congrats on making it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would like to thank all of my patrons. So, bye. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm impressed that you made it this far. Remember to come on over to together.lol and take a look at it. Tell me what you think and help me feel embarrassed about what early alpha stage it's in. I'd love to get your thoughts and I'd love to talk to you on there. Thanks.